Fundamentals of Mixing, lesson number 5 in the Mixing and Sound section. This is the last of the Mixing and Sound videos. So this one is the secrets, quote unquote, of the great mixers. This is just a lecture thing, so if you're expecting graphics or audio examples or anything like that, that's not really the purpose of this. And the real reason why I wanted to do this, and it was really inspired by a comment that was sent to me, and regarding some of the previous videos to this. I'm always very responsive to people who send messages to me and notes to me, because it informs me about what people are thinking and how people are going about approaching music, what they are missing, what they're understanding. Sometimes in doing something for a very long time, it's very easy to be blinded to what it's like. And for me, it would be what I was like 30 years ago when I was first entering into recording studios and trying to learn the art of mixing and mastering and recording from other engineers. And so if I take that process all the way back into college, it would be 34 years ago. So quite a long time ago. I'd been studying and trying to learn this. But with all the experiences and all the things that I've gone through since then, what happens is that it's easy for me to forget about the way that I thought, or some of the things that were confusing to me back then that are crystal clear. In fact, so clear that I just sort of step over them as sort of common knowledge when they're not actually common knowledge. And the interesting part about that and getting into this is that there are no real, quote unquote, secrets of the great mixers. What's interesting to me and the way that I've looked at it over the years is that, it's no conspiracy. There's no sort of secret society that's involved. There's no, I guess, I don't know, Da Vinci Code or anything like that that can be taken away. I mean, every engineer had the same basic gear to work with. Some had an affinity to certain types of gear over others, and for many that created signature sounds for those particular engineers. Maybe they found a way, they mastered those particular pieces of gear and they manufactured and created a sound. They were very sensitive to way that particular gear was overdriven or how to use it. And maybe the acoustics of a particular studio or room or control room were just happened to be a very good match for them as producers or mix engineers. And so they tried to do most of their work within that environment. But for the person learning, for the person who was coming into a studio, for most of the history of music, there wasn't really any kind of education that you could get in terms of recording and mixing. It was something where you would just, get into a studio one way or another. Maybe it was through somebody you knew. Maybe it was just by being a nuisance and hanging out at the front door and until somebody let you in, or begging somebody to say, "Hey, listen, I'll sweep floors, I'll do whatever, clean bathrooms, just to kind of get into studios and learn." And if the person was, maybe at a more, I don't know, commercial studio facility, or maybe corporate facility like Abbey Road or something like that, they're probably, they probably came up in some other way through it. Maybe, as, I don't know if they had interns back then, but they certainly had people that were there to help out. And if you connect with the right people, then you start to learn about recording, and eventually you find enough trust or get enough trust that you end up in the studio. And your job there is in studio is to assist the engineer with the process and the artist with the process of making the record. So that means knowing all of the equipment in the studio better than the engineer that may be using it. In the earlier days, there were staff engineers that were employed by the studio. So when an artist came in, the engineer would get paid by the studio. That studio, if it was an independent studio, may bill the record company, charge the record company $100 an hour and pay the engineer $25. That was not an uncommon, thing. And so what would end up happening is those engineers would get tons of work that would automatically be brought into them by the studio managers and the people that were booking the studios. And if it was owned by a record company, then the record company would be feeding their artists a steady stream of them into the studio, and the engineers would be recording them. And the assistants, the second engineers, the people who were there, would be learning by watching. And in those early situations, there were apprenticeship situations where an engineer would be showing the second engineer how things work and the way things work and why a particular miking technique is used or why they mixed or processed something in the way. But for the most part, most of the learning came by watching. When I entered into being a second engineer and started to learn, after I broke through all of the initial process of breaking into the studio and sweeping floors and changing light bulbs and filling fruit baskets and all that sort of stuff, and I got myself into the actual rooms where I was assisting for engineers, I had studied my ass off about every piece of gear that was in that studio and bothered all the assistants nonstop, constantly asking them questions, talking to the technical staff, asking them, why is this way? How is that designed? Why does this work this way, etc. And that built a confidence in the studio manager and the staff. So when a position came available, I would get in to be the second engineer. And as a second engineer, the job is to basically write down everything that the engineer is doing. It's your job to document everything, particularly in the mix process. And that, so by default, the mix engineer, even if they wanted to hide something, they couldn't, because you were literally writing down all the settings. But the real secret of the mix engineers and the real, the people who were making records, for all the record labels that were really the people who were hired nonstop specifically for mixing, and I worked with many of them, those people were so good at what they did that even if you wrote down and understood all of the settings and exactly what gear they used in every situation, you would still never be able to recreate what it was that they had done. And the biggest reason for that is that the settings are not what is the most important thing. There are so many other things that are going on that you don't see that allow the thing that they do that you cling to, like the attack time on a bass or the release time on a bass, or whether they use this compressor or that compressor. What made that work was the way that they set it up, the way that they actually fashioned the mix and designed the mix in their head so that piece of gear that they used was most effective. So if they put that 1176 in all buttons mode on the vocal and it gave this like ridiculous, insane sound, and you were listening to it and it's like, oh my God, I want to use that on everything. And then you go to put it in your mix and it's like, okay, I have it doing basically exactly the same thing as what this, amazing engineer, the Bob Clearmountain did, or George Massenburg did, or some amazing engineer did. And I'm not getting the same results. Why? It's the same setting. It's the same thing. It's a similar song. You could go through all of the things. And then you come to realize over the years that what made it so effective were all the things and all the decisions that led up to that place. So that when they inserted that thing, it was the perfect effect at the perfect time, given everything else that was going on. So they were making decisions that were of a much higher order than I was capable of understanding. So even though I understood all the settings and I understood the differences between a Fairchild and an LA2A or any of the vintage pieces of gear that were out there, and I understood the components that were in them, and to greater or lesser degrees, I understood all the attack times and things like that. Never really thought about it in milliseconds, but I at least knew fast attack, slow attack, medium attack, some basic settings, because these things were not always clearly documented. Or I think I became more number understanding of numbers and equating things to numbers when they started getting into plugins and seeing the plugin versions. And then when you start to see the numbers, it's like, okay, all right, well, those, now I have to equate something to the number here. Whereas before I would just turn a release time, not knowing exactly what it was, but getting it until it felt right. And in a way, there was sort of a beauty to that of not knowing the numbers, because your setting would never be influenced by a number or a particular position. It would only be influenced by the sound, what we were getting back from the piece of gear. So in making something like this, there is a tendency for someone to think, oh, if I understand these basic principles, that I'll be a great mix engineer. And it's not really the case. There was a principle, and I want to say it was Malcolm Gladwell that stated it, but I could be wrong about that. So if I'm not, I apologize. But it's the 10,000 hour thing, like that it takes 10,000 hours of work to master something. And to equate that into time, if you were mixing 40 hours a week, like a standard work week for a person, 40 hours a week through 50 weeks of a year, giving yourself 2 weeks of vacation, then that would give you 2,000 hours per year, which means that you would have to have 5 solid years of full-time work on mixing to quote-unquote master it. And to me, that is a real shortfall on mixing. Mixing is something that continues to evolve like any art form over years and years and years of experience. So certainly you can get better at it by doing it more, just like anybody. You pick up a guitar. If you play it 5 minutes a day, you're only going to get 5 minutes a day better. If you play it 10 minutes a day or an hour a day or 5 hours a day, you're going to get 5 hours a day better every day. And so the thing is that, and part of the reason why I really created these courses and all the courses that I've created and starting to put all of this stuff together was that I realized that there was a disconnect in the order of and the structure of the way that most people learned about the art of mixing. And there are still people today who learn the way that I learned. They get jobs in a recording studio, and they assist engineers, top engineers in the industry, and they learn the way that I learned. But it's such a vast minority by comparison to the way that things have gone. And part of the transformation of recording into the DAW era has meant that there's been a disconnect, that people are trying to learn how to make professional records without having ever had an ear, an eye, or a place on watching people do it year after year, and never having really experienced being a part of that process for years on end and making a living doing it. And as a result, you immediately, from that perspective, you operate at a disadvantage. So that even if you've been mixing for 10 years, but you've been practicing principles that are not really correct or not fully sound, then what happens is you're practicing something that is perhaps inaccurate or flawed in some kind of way. So your ability to get better may be hampered or limited by the way that you've been approaching mixing and the way that you've been approaching music and the way that your mixes are structured. And so then what will end up happening is that many people will go right on to the internet, because there's an incredible resource of almost anything that you want to know on the internet. And then the crapshoot there, the gamble there, is that you're finding somebody who really knows what they're talking about and really knows what they're doing, versus somebody who sort of knows and is just teaching you more wrong information. The thing that I want to be clear about, because I'm not creating this to say, look, I'm the only one out there that knows, what's going on. That's not my position to say that. And I don't really give a crap about that, to be completely honest with you. The purpose of creating this and making it public means that anybody would have access to this. So other people can come in and watch this information and may integrate it into their own teaching and integrate it into their own work. And I'm completely fine with that. That's not the reason why I'm doing this to be high and mighty or to be superior to anybody. Because the great mix engineers and all of these the mixing with masters people, if you want to look at it from that perspective, they understand all the principles and the things that I teach but perhaps using a different language or a different way of explaining. And you see, the thing that has happened over the years is that in transitioning from an apprenticeship type of situation into an environment where education on recording is now an incredibly common thing. Like most colleges, it seems today, have some form of audio program that used to be a communications program, and from communications, it's now expanded into audio engineering skills, and where people are learning multimedia skills. And all of the apps and all of the technology is making it so that someone who makes a movie is not only the director, they're also the camera person. They're also they're everything. They're the music director, and they're mixing and blending and doing all the Foley work and all the things that go into doing that. And they're multi-purposing, they're multitasking, and so there's a lot of information out there. And so the recording programs that you see that are out there in the world, the limitation there is that mixing is quite often a 1-week course or a 2-week course at best, where you get lessons. And mixing, to me, could be the subject matter of a whole master's program, and easily, or it could be a whole 4-year college degree type of program. It's not something that is easily learned. In fact, to me, mixing is the most long-term, or the most difficult skill to learn of all the engineering skills, and tracking skills are probably the second in terms of doing real tracking sessions with full bands are probably the second most difficult task to do, and the reason is that there is no map for it, because when you're tracking, you can watch some videos on vocal recording techniques and get a great sound on a vocal mic. When you start to mix a song, you can get a lot of videos that talk about how to get a great bass sound or how to get a great kick drum or drum sound. And so you can copy paste all the approaches from all these different videos that you put, and you paste it together in your song and you listen to it. And in the end, maybe it sonically sounds good. You say, wow, that's a great snare sound, and that's a great bass sound, and that's a great vocal sound, and it sounds like shit. And that's a thing that is really important to understand, because you look at it and you say, why doesn't this work? I followed this technique. I followed this way of doing things. And the secret, quote unquote, of great mixing and great mixers is that they understand fundamentally that everything is in relationship to everything else. So very much like a magician who works with a sleight of hand, who focuses your attention on a particular location so that the effect of the magic trick happening is most effective. In other words, most of the time they attract your attention away from what is actually going on. And then when the magic trick, the rabbit comes out of the hat or whatever it is that ends up happening, then you get the wide eyes, like wow, how did they happen? How did they do that? How did he make the Statue of Liberty disappear? Whatever that is. And so it's the same sort of thing with mixing. It's a lot of sleight of hand. It's about how you set something up. So what the great mix engineers understand, and they may not be able to explain it, and they may never explain it exactly the way that I do, but they're talking about the same exact things. They do understand it. They understand how to do it. I've broken it down into as much of a technical, discrete process as I've been able to, and I continue to do that. So every day, every time I work on something, I am constantly working on new ways of explaining things, new metaphors that I can use to help explain, that fill in the picture, that allow you or give you the functional tools that allow you to problem solve without giving you these cookie cutter ways of approaching things. Because in the end, if you really study it, what you want is you want the ways that you can manage situations. The art of engineering and all of engineering is about problem solving. It's saying we have this thing that we want to achieve. How do we go about achieving it? And so an engineer in any field, that might be an architect who has to design a building that exists on a certain structure. Maybe it's very close to water. Maybe it needs to be somehow protected from that water in a way that's different from a typical building. So engineers are hired to design a way of keeping that water coming in. Electric Lady Studios is a classic example of that. It sits on top of a stream, and whenever it rains, that stream would flood up into the studio. It flooded 3 times during construction. So just a rainstorm would come in, water would flood. So they had to design a system, a sub pump system that would keep the water out of coming up and building into the studio. And that water, right, that stream that would run under Electric Lady Studios, the Minetta Creek, is exactly what it is. You went into Electric Lady and you walked all the way down, because it's basically like 2 stories below ground. And if you walked all the way down to the end and went into the back closet, you'd see this machine closet, and you look down there and there's like a fishing hole down in the bottom with a big pipe going down the middle. And I'd swear you could probably catch a 4-eyed fish out of there if you stuck a line down there. But what would happen is that pump system would prevent the water from coming up. And it was also part of what made that studio sound so great. The humidity gave a heaviness to it. There were walls in that studio that literally need to be torn down and rebuilt like every 5 years because of water seeping up into the walls of the place, in certain areas. It's amazing. But that's engineering. That's a different type of engineering. And what we're talking about here is working with audio. So the thing that I want you to understand as you go through this course, and this may be the last video that you watch, if it's the one that you, if you've even made it this far into the video. But the thing that I want you to take away from this is that all the techniques and all the things that I show you are not the end-all be-all, okay? They are, and the working methods are all flexible. But what I want to show you is, and give you the skills to be able to manipulate sound. That's the whole idea. It's the most difficult thing that I found to teach, and in teaching with students. And I have private students through the school, and when I teach those private students, the most difficult thing to teach is the why. It's not the techniques themselves. They learn those techniques pretty quickly. If I say move the drum kit over here, they can move it over there very quickly. They know all the attack times, release times. They know the settings. They know how to set up all the things that influence the binaural hearing that allows a drum kit to be moved back, or the size of a space to be made bigger, or a vocal to be big and up and front and forward. And they can accomplish those things. But the one thing that's the hardest to teach is the vision, the decision making in terms of listening to a song and saying the vocal should be processed in this particular way, because that method is what most effectively transmits the feeling and the vibe and the emotion of that particular song. So the selection of the reverb, you could use a plate, you could use a hall, you could use a room reverb or whatever, you could use slap delays, but which one of those is most appropriate, and how is it colored, and is it distorted or chorused, or is it flanged, or is it made really warm, or is it made really bright, and why would you do that? And those decisions, when you get past that initial thing, are the ones that make a mix feel great. Those are the things that make something not just sonically sound great, not just have all the frequencies and the response and translate from all the speaker systems and all that, but they're actually something that somebody would want to listen to more than once, where they listen to it and they connect with it on some level. No matter how great feeling you make a mix, you have to understand that it's not going to translate to anybody, to everybody, okay? You'll reach a certain audience, just like every movie, right? Every movie that's out there, comedies will appeal to people who like comedies. and action movies will appeal to people who like action movies or science fiction movies. And that's why we have all different types, and that's why we have different styles of music and types of music. So, in really studying a style of music that you are very familiar with and that you love and you have a good ear for, you need to be very sensitive to those types of things in the design and creation of the music that you want. And the great mix engineers, the people who really understand this, whether they consciously know it or whether it's just intuitively built into their DNA, like somebody who just picks up a guitar and just starts shredding at the age of 5 years old and nobody knows why, or, some little kid that, comes on, Jimmy Fallon or whatever is like 5 years old and just sitting there ripping, piano solos. And you're like, where the hell did that come from? Like, how did that happen? It's not even physically possible. This little kid with these tiny little hands can do all these ridiculous things. And so you have that, and that exists in the mixing realm as well. And there are people who study it in other ways, achieve the same ends, achieve the same great results, but they go about the process of getting there in a different way. And so it's important to kind of understand that, and also to be patient with it. The one thing I want to lean against with this is to get into a sort of paint by numbers approach to mixing. And the paint by numbers approach is what I was talking about before, where you cookie cutter different approaches. And so insert great bass sound, insert great snare sound, insert great guitar sound, insert great vocal sound, and that equals great record. And the answer is almost never. And part of what makes those individual sounds so great is the way that they complement and balance each other. And that's something that is the art of mixing. And it's all of the basic stuff, and that's where we're leading right into next, that makes this all happen. One of the things that is probably the most important concept to understand with all of this is mastering the basics. The basics are the foundation for everything else that you do. When you have the basics right, you can manipulate sound and do almost anything you want with it. And make it and mush it around and like Play-Doh, put it anywhere that you want, any shape that you want, make Mr. Bill dolls with it, whatever it is that you want to do, you can do with sound once you kind of learn the techniques and understand, how to manipulate sound, what it takes. And then it's up to your own creative intuition from there to manipulate it in such a way that it translates into something that conveys the emotion and feeling and meaning of the song that it is that you're mixing. So anyway, on that note, a little more longer than I expected this to go, but that's a foundational principle for the rest of all of the videos and lessons that are part of this fundamentals of mixing. And I'll leave it at that. And if you're still hanging on, then pick up with lesson number 6.